Picture the World Wrestling Federation at the absolute height of its larger-than-life era. Hulk Hogan was still the biggest name in wrestling. The Undertaker was becoming something wrestling had never seen before. Jake Roberts was descending into his darkest and most dangerous form. Sid Justice looked like a monster built in a laboratory. Shawn Michaels had just shattered the rockers and was beginning his transformation into the Heartbreak Kid. And somewhere underneath all of them, Bret Hart was quietly becoming the man who would inherit the company. And for one unforgettable summer night, more than 80,000 fans packed Wembley Stadium for one of the most spectacular shows the World Wrestling Federation had ever produced. On paper, 1992 looks like one of the greatest years in company history, because few years had this much talent, this many iconic matches, or this many moments that still feel enormous decades later. The Royal Rumble produced perhaps the greatest Rumble match ever assembled. WrestleMania VIII gave us Savage and Flair in a brutally personal championship war. SummerSlam turned Bret Hart and the British Bulldog into legends in front of a roaring London crowd. But behind all of it, the empire was beginning to shake. The machine that had dominated American wrestling for nearly a decade was losing the man it had been built around. Hulk Hogan was quietly disappearing. A federal investigation was closing in. Vince McMahon's company was facing questions far more dangerous than anything happening inside the ring. And suddenly, the World Wrestling Federation had to figure out what came after Hulkamania. That tension is what makes 1992 so fascinating. It was simultaneously the spectacular final chapter of one era and the accidental beginning of another. This is the World Wrestling Federation in 1992. But first, let's go back to the end of 1991. For nearly a decade, the World Wrestling Federation had been synonymous with one thing: Hulkamania, the blonde mustache, the torn t-shirts, the 24-inch pythons, the finger cupped to the ear as arenas full of people roared. Hulk Hogan wasn't just the top star, he was the entire business model. He was the reason the company had conquered the old regional territories, the reason it had national television, the reason it had a cartoon and action figures and everything else. If you were a kid in the 1980s, Hulk Hogan was as famous as any athlete or movie star alive. But by late 1991, the shine was starting to come off. The Hulkamania formula had been running for years and it was getting stale. Adults had stopped believing, and worse than that, something far darker was gathering on the horizon. The substances problem in professional wrestling had been an open secret for years. Everybody knew. You looked at the impossibly swollen physiques on television and you understood on some level that these bodies were not built on chicken and hard work alone, but knowing something quietly and having it splashed across national headlines are two very different things. And in 1991, a doctor named George Zahorian, who had worked for the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission, was convicted of illegally distributing substances. During that case, names came out, big names, the biggest name of all. Zahorian had been, for years, effectively the doctor on call for the wrestlers passing through Pennsylvania. When his case went to trial, the details of who he had supplied became a matter of public record, and the press seized on them. The New York Post, in particular, had a columnist named Phil Mushnick who went after the company relentlessly, week after week, turning what might have been a passing scandal into a sustained assault on the World Wrestling Federation's reputation. This was no longer a whisper in the locker room. This was front page material. Suddenly, the mainstream press had a story. And the story wasn't about body slams and championship belts. It was about drugs. It was about a company allegedly built on illegal substances. And the man at the center of it all, the promoter who had turned a regional wrestling company into a billion-dollar empire, Vince McMahon, was about to spend the next couple of years fighting for his freedom. In the summer of 1991, in an attempt to get ahead of the storm, McMahon had already announced that the company would begin drug testing, and he even publicly admitted to his own past substances use. But announcing a testing program and rebuilding public trust are two very different tasks. The genie was out of the bottle and it was not going back in, and the knock-on effects of that were enormous, and they shaped the entire product you were about to see. Because if the government and the press were watching what kinds of bodies the company was putting on television, then the days of pushing enormous chemically inflated physiques as the definition of a star were numbered. If you look closely at the wrestlers on World Wrestling Federation programming across 1992, you can actually see it happening. The men who had been grotesquely swollen the year before started to look noticeably smaller. The aesthetic of the entire company was being forced to change, not because of a creative decision made in a boardroom, but because of a legal reality closing in from the outside. That's the shadow hanging over everything you're about to see. As 1992 dawned, the World Wrestling Federation looked, from the outside, like the same juggernaut it had always been. But inside, the walls were starting to close in. The federal government was circling, the press was hostile, and the company's biggest star was quietly heading for the exit. So the question that defined the entire year was simple. If not Hogan, then who? Who carries this company into its uncertain future? The answer to that question would take 12 months to reveal itself, and the search would produce some of the greatest moments in the company's history, right alongside some of its most embarrassing failures. It all kicked off in January. The World Wrestling Federation Championship, the most important prize in the company, was sitting vacant as the new year began, and the reason it was vacant is a story all by itself. At the end of 1991, the title had been bouncing around in chaos. The Undertaker, a genuinely frightening newcomer who had debuted just over a year earlier, shocked the world by beating Hulk Hogan for the championship at Survivor Series in November. The finish was controversial, involving interference from Ric Flair, who had recently jumped to the company. 6 days later, at a show called This Tuesday in Texas, Hogan won the belt right back. But that finish was controversial too, with Hogan using the ashes from the Undertaker's own funeral urn to blind him and steal the win. 2 controversial finishes in a row, 2 tainted title changes, and so the on-screen president of the company, Jack Tunney, a man whose entire job was to look serious and make dramatic proclamations, declared the championship vacant. He announced that the title would be awarded to whoever won the upcoming Royal Rumble match. Now stop and think about how big that was. The Royal Rumble is a 30-man over-the-top rope battle royal. Wrestlers enter at timed intervals, and you're eliminated when you're thrown over the top rope and both feet hit the floor. The last man standing wins. Normally, winning the Rumble earns you a championship match at WrestleMania, but this year, for the first and only time in the match's history to that point, the championship itself was on the line. Win the Rumble and you don't just get a title shot. You walk out as champion of the world. The Royal Rumble took place on January 19th, 1992 in Albany, New York. And what happened over the next hour is, to this day, considered by many to be the single greatest Royal Rumble match ever contested. At the center of it was Ric Flair. Flair was a legend, but he was a legend from somewhere else. For years, he had been the top star of the National Wrestling Alliance and World Championship Wrestling, the World Wrestling Federation's biggest rival. He was a 16-time world champion in that world, the man they called the Nature Boy, the dirtiest player in the game, a performer of almost supernatural gifts on the microphone and in the ring. When he had a falling out with WCW and jumped ship in late 1991, it was an earthquake. And he made his arrival even more outrageous by showing up on World Wrestling Federation television, still holding the WCW World Title belt, proclaiming himself the real world's champion. And what a field it was. This was the last great gathering of the old guard, all in one ring. Hulk Hogan was in it, Randy Savage was in it, The Undertaker was in it, Roddy Piper, the loudmouth Scotsman was there, Jake the Snake Roberts, now a sinister villain, was there. The British Bulldog and the $1 Million Man had started the whole thing off, drawing numbers 1 and 2. The Legion of Doom, the Beverly Brothers, Sergeant Slaughter, Jim Duggan, the Texas Tornado, the Berserker, Repo Man, virtually every recognizable name on the roster took their turn walking down that aisle. It was a murderer's row of star power, the kind of lineup the company would struggle to assemble ever again, precisely because so many of these men would be gone within the year. At the Royal Rumble, Flair drew the number 3 entry position. That's a death sentence in a Rumble. It means you have to survive the entire match, fighting off wave after wave of fresh opponents from almost the very beginning. No one entering that early was supposed to have a chance. Gorilla Monsoon, calling the action, pointed out that nobody who had entered between 1 and 5 had ever won. And so Ric Flair went to war. And for nearly an hour, he fought. He survived. He dumped opponents over the top rope. He clung to the ropes when it was his turn to be thrown. He begged, he cheated, he bled the clock dry with every trick he knew. And in his corner, At the announce table, his manager Bobby Heenan lost his mind completely. Heenan's commentary that night is legendary in its own right. A wild roller coaster of panic and joy as Flair teetered on the edge of elimination again and again. Every time Flair nearly went out, Heenan wailed like the world was ending. The final four came down to Flair, Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and Sid Justice. Sid, a massive and unpredictable powerhouse, was still a good guy at this point, but the seeds of chaos were being planted. Flair eliminated Savage, then Sid double-crossed the moment by eliminating Hogan, throwing his own supposed ally over the top rope. The crowd, in a sign of exactly how much the tide was turning, actually cheered Hogan getting tossed. And as Sid celebrated, a furious Hogan reached back into the ring, grabbed Sid's arm and held him in place long enough for Ric Flair to shove him over the top and win it all. Ric Flair had done the impossible. Entering at number 3, lasting just over an hour, he won the Royal Rumble and the vacant World Wrestling Federation Championship. In the moment after the bell, he cut one of the most emotional promos of his career, tears in his eyes declaring that this was the greatest moment of his life. It made him only the second man in history to hold both the NWA and World Wrestling Federation world titles. The first being the original Nature Boy Buddy Rogers decades earlier. It was a genuinely perfect piece of storytelling, but it also raised a fascinating question about where the company was headed, because the man they had just crowned was not a homegrown World Wrestling Federation hero. He was a rivals champion. He was proof that the company, for all its swagger, needed to raid the competition to find a star big enough to carry a title. And that tells you something about how thin the roster was getting at the very top. With Flair now champion, all eyes turned toward WrestleMania. And here's where the year takes its first strange turn. The obvious main event, the dream match, the money match, was Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair. Two icons, two generations. The biggest star the World Wrestling Federation had ever produced against the biggest star its greatest rival had ever produced. Fans wanted it desperately. The company teased it on house shows around the country. Hogan and Flair actually did wrestle each other, and audiences went home happy. It seemed inevitable that this would be the WrestleMania main event. And then it wasn't. For a variety of reasons that have been debated ever since, involving how well the house show matches were drawing and Hogan's own uncertain future, the company pulled the plug on Hogan vs. Flair for the big stage. Instead, WrestleMania VIII was reorganized into a double main event. Two separate marquee matches, each promoted as equally important. WrestleMania VIII took place on April 5th, 1992 at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis in front of a crowd of more than 60,000 people. The first of the two headline matches saw Ric Flair defend his newly won championship against the Macho Man, Randy Savage, and this one had a story with real venom to it. The angle going in was deeply personal and, by the standards of 1992 television, genuinely edgy. Flair and his manager, Mr. Perfect, claimed that before Savage had ever met his valet and real-life wife, Miss Elizabeth, she had been with Flair. They flashed doctored photographs on screen. They taunted Savage relentlessly about his own wife. It drove the Macho Man into a genuine frenzy. The match itself was a classic. Savage wrestled like a man possessed, desperate, reckless, throwing himself at Flair with everything he had. Flair bled heavily, which is worth noting, because at this time the company had a strict no-blood policy. Bret Hart had gotten away with blading in an earlier match by passing it off as accidental. Flair, on the other hand, was caught red-handed on camera opening himself up and got chewed out and fined for it afterward by Vince McMahon. But the blood added to the sense that this was a real, bitter fight. In the end, Savage pinned Flair to win the championship. The Macho Man was champion of the world again. The second headline match was Hulk Hogan against Sid Justice. This was the consolation prize after the Flair Dream match fell through, and it was widely understood to be, quite possibly, Hogan's final match with the company. He was heading off to Hollywood. His contract situation was murky, and the whole thing had the feeling of a goodbye. Unfortunately, the match was a disaster. Not a classic goodbye, but one of the most poorly regarded main events in WrestleMania history. The finish fell apart in real time. The plan called for a new character, a voodoo practitioner named Papa Shango, to run in and interfere, drawing a disqualification. But Papa Shango was late getting to the ring, so the sequence just sort of collapsed. Sid kicked out of Hogan's finishing leg drop, which was almost unheard of. The timing went to pieces, and eventually the bell rang for a disqualification with the ring in chaos. After the match, as Sid and his manager beat Hogan down, the Ultimate Warrior made his shocking return, running to the ring to save Hogan after an absence of many months. The crowd popped for the surprise, but it couldn't rescue what had been a badly botched main event. WrestleMania VIII then is a perfect snapshot of the whole year. One genuinely great match built on old school storytelling, sharing the top of the card with a clumsy, awkward mess that showed the cracks in the machine, and underneath it all, the sense of an era ending. The Golden Age was clearly over. The only question was what would replace it. Before we move on, it's worth pausing on the rest of the card, because 1992 was not only a story about the world title. Underneath the main event, the company was churning through characters and feuds at a furious pace, and much of it reflected the same strange energy of a company in transition. The tag team division was a good example of the chaos. As the year opened, the World Tag Team Championship belonged to the Legion of Doom, the face-painted, spike-shouldered team of Hawk and Animal, one of the most intimidating duos in the history of the business. But in February, a brand new team took the belts from them. That team was Money Inc., a pairing of the $1 Million Man, wrestling's ultimate arrogant rich villain, and Erwin R. Shyster, better known as IRS, a character whose entire gimmick was being a nagging tax collector who lectured the audience about paying their taxes. On paper, it sounds absurd. In practice, the $1 Million Man's sneering wealth and IRS's smug bookishness made them a genuinely hateable and effective team, and they became one of the anchors of the division for the next couple of years. Money Inc. spent the year feuding with a rotating cast of challengers. There were the natural disasters, the enormous tandem of Earthquake and Typhoon, close to 1,000 pounds of combined weight, who had turned from villains into lovable giants and actually captured the tag titles from Money Inc. during the summer before dropping them back in the autumn. There were the Nasty Boys, a pair of brawling slobs who went through their own dramatic split from their manager Jimmy Hart when he favored Money Inc. over them, turning them into good guys almost overnight. And there were the debuting Head Shrinkers, a wild Samoan team who would become a fixture soon after. The whole division was a churning, shifting mess of alliances and betrayals, most of it orchestrated by the scheming manager Jimmy Hart. And while none of it reached the heights of the world title picture, it kept the shows moving. The mid-card, meanwhile, was where some of the year's most memorable characters lived, for better and for worse. There was Tatanka, a proud Native American character who went the entire year without a single loss, slowly building an undefeated streak that made him a fan favorite. There was the debut of Razor Ramon in the middle of the year, a slick and menacing tough guy whose vignettes, oozing arrogance and Cuban accented swagger, immediately set him apart as a future star. There was Crush, a face-painted powerhouse. There was Kamala, the wild-eyed Ugandan giant. And then there was the darker, stranger material. A brand new villain named Niles debuted through a series of chilling vignettes. Niles was a former convict who claimed the Big Boss Man, a good guy character who had once worked as a corrections officer, had brutalized him in prison. Their feud culminated in one of the most genuinely uncomfortable segments of the year, a savage beatdown of the Boss Man that wrote him off television for months. The character was a rare attempt at gritty realism in a cartoon world, and it was as unsettling as it was memorable. The Undertaker, who had debuted only in late 1990, continued his slow, unstoppable rise across the year. He had turned from a terrifying monster villain into a beloved, otherworldly good guy, and he feuded with Jake Roberts leading into WrestleMania, and later with the Berserker and Kamala, his casket matches becoming a signature attraction. And in a talk show segment early in the year, one of the most important character moments of the decade quietly took place. On a set called The Barbershop, the cocky young Shawn Michaels turned on his tag team partner, Marty Jannetty, super kicking him and hurling him through a plate glass window. It was brutal, it was shocking, and it was the birth of one of the greatest singles careers the industry would ever see. All of it. The tag team musical chairs, the undefeated streaks, the convict feuds, and the barbershop betrayals painted a picture of a company throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. Some of it was brilliant, some of it was embarrassing, but taken together, it was the sound of a company frantically searching for its next generation of stars, because it was about to lose almost all of its current ones. After WrestleMania, Hulk Hogan was essentially gone. He would not wrestle a regular schedule again for a long time. The biggest star in the history of the company had quietly exited right in the middle of the substances storm, and the World Wrestling Federation was now, for the first time in almost a decade, a company without its central sun. So they turned to the Ultimate Warrior. On paper, Warrior was the logical next choice. He was enormous. He was colorful. His face paint and tassels and manic energy made him a merchandising machine, and he had beaten Hogan cleanly at WrestleMania VI 2 years earlier. If anyone could inherit the Hulkamania role, surely it was him. But it didn't work. The story they built for him after WrestleMania was that voodoo villain Papa Shango had placed a curse on him. And the execution of that curse was, to put it kindly, ridiculous. There were segments of Warrior mysteriously vomiting backstage, segments of a black ooze dripping from his head like something out of a low-budget horror film. It was supposed to be supernatural and menacing. Instead, it was unintentionally hilarious, and it did nothing to establish Warrior as a credible standard bearer. And then, in the late summer, the Ultimate Warrior left the company again. Contract disputes, backstage friction, the swirling drug allegations, all of it combined, and just like that, the second choice to lead the company was gone too. Now the World Wrestling Federation had lost both Hogan and Warrior in the space of a few months. The two biggest, most marketable stars of the muscle-bound era had walked out the door, and the search for a new leader was more urgent than ever. This is the moment where the year really pivots. Because with the Giants gone, the company had no choice but to look at the men it had previously considered too small, too plain, too unspectacular to carry the load. And in doing so, almost by accident, it stumbled onto the future. But before we get to that future, we have to talk about London. Because in the middle of this chaotic, uncertain year, the World Wrestling Federation produced one of the greatest single nights in its entire history. And fittingly, it did so an ocean away from the American troubles that were tearing at it. The business in the United States was hurting. Attendance was falling. The scandals were dragging the brand through the mud. The house shows that had once sold out arenas coast to coast were now playing to visible empty seats. But across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom, wrestling was red hot. British fans had fallen in love with the World Wrestling Federation product through television, and their enthusiasm was undimmed by the American scandals that meant little to them. And so Vince McMahon made a bold decision. He would take SummerSlam, one of the company's 4 biggest annual events, out of America entirely and hold it in Wembley Stadium in London. It was, in part, a calculated escape. If the American market was souring, why not throw the biggest party of the summer somewhere the fans were still hungry for it? The tagline the company chose for the event said it all. They called it the SummerSlam you thought you'd never see. SummerSlam took place at the end of August 1992. The announced attendance was more than 80,000 people. The real figure was just shy of 79,000, but either way, it was a staggering ocean of humanity crowd, filling an enormous football stadium under the English sky. The tickets had reportedly sold out in a matter of hours, and the main event was not for the World Wrestling Federation Championship, it was for the Intercontinental Championship, the company's number 2 title. That alone tells you how special this match was, because a secondary title almost never closes a major show over the world title, but there was a reason. The challenger was the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, a genuine English hero returning home, and the champion was his own brother-in-law, Bret Hart. The story was beautifully simple. 2 good guys, 2 members of the same family, connected by marriage, both trained in the legendary Hart family dungeon in Calgary. One of them was going to walk out of Wembley a winner, and one was going to lose in front of the Bulldog's entire home nation. Bret Hart's sister, Diana, married to the Bulldog, sat in the crowd literally unsure which man to cheer for, torn between her brother and her husband. What most of the 80,000 fans in that stadium did not know was that behind the scenes, this match was a minor miracle. The Bulldog, by many accounts, was in rough shape going into the event, dealing with serious personal problems, and was not in the right condition to perform at a high level. Bret Hart, one of the most technically gifted performers who ever lived, essentially had to guide his brother-in-law through the entire match, calling it on the fly, covering for mistakes, structuring every moment so that the crowd never saw the seams. Bret would later call it perhaps the greatest match of his life, precisely because of how much he had to carry on his shoulders while making it look effortless. And the finish was perfect. After nearly half an hour of back and forth drama with the crowd roaring at a deafening volume, the Bulldog reversed a move and rolled Bret up for the pinfall. Wembley Stadium exploded. Union Jacks waved as far as the eye could see. The British Bulldog, a hometown boy, had won a championship in front of his own people in the biggest moment of his career. Bret, ever the professional, shook his hand afterward, and the two brothers-in-law raised each other's arms in a show of respect. It was a genuinely magical night, and it stands as one of the great ironies of 1992. In a year when the American arm of the business was crumbling under scandal and stale stars, the company reached its single greatest artistic and emotional peak on foreign soil, with a match headlined by two men who represented not the muscle-bound past, but the more athletic, more grounded future. Because make no mistake, the man who really made SummerSlam sing was Bret Hart. And Bret Hart was about to become the answer to the question that had haunted the company all year long. Bret Hart did not look like a World Wrestling Federation main event star of the 1980s. He wasn't a towering giant. He wasn't grotesquely muscled. He didn't have a booming, larger-than-life persona full of catchphrases and cartoon energy. He was, by the standards of the Hulkamania era, almost ordinary. What he had instead was substance. He was arguably the finest in-ring technician in the entire company, a man who could make any opponent look good, who told stories with wrestling holds and psychology rather than with theatrics. He had spent years as a tag team specialist alongside Jim and then reinvented himself as a superb intercontinental champion. For most of his career, the idea that Bret Hart could be the top guy, the world champion, the face of the entire company would have seemed almost laughable. He was too small, too quiet, too normal. But 1992 changed the math, with Hogan gone, with Warrior gone, with the substances crackdown making the company nervous about pushing enormous chemically enhanced physiques. Suddenly, a smaller, cleaner, technically brilliant performer looked less like a compromise and more like a solution. And so we come to one of the most understated, unusual title changes in the company's history. On the 1st of September, Ric Flair had regained the World Wrestling Federation Championship from Randy Savage, largely because Savage was dealing with an injury and Warrior was on his way out, leaving the title picture in flux. So Flair was champion once again as autumn arrived. But Flair himself was banged up, having suffered an ear injury in matches against the Ultimate Warrior, and the company needed to make a decision about the future. That decision came on October 12th, 1992 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Saskatoon was the hometown region of the legendary Stu Hart, Bret's father, the patriarch of the Hart wrestling family. And on that night, at a television taping that was not even being broadcast live, in a match recorded for a home video release, Bret Hart was called into Vince McMahon's office. Bret has told the story many times. He walked in fearing he was about to be fired, given how chaotic the company was. Instead, McMahon told him that he was going to be the next champion of the World Wrestling Federation that very night. And the match itself went nearly half an hour. Flair, working through his injury, guided the veteran's story while Bret brought the technical fire. And at the end, Bret Hart locked in his signature submission hold, the sharpshooter, wrenching back on Flair's legs until the Nature Boy submitted. Bret Hart was the champion of the world, and the way he celebrated said everything about who he was. There were no fireworks, no 10,000-seat arena erupting, no pay-per-view cameras beaming it around the globe. It happened in a Canadian building at an untelevised taping, and Bret simply climbed to the second rope and held the belt up, looking out at the faces of fans in his father's home country. He would later describe it as the single greatest moment of his entire career, a moment no one could ever take away from him. Think about what a strange thing that is. The most important prize in the company, the title once carried by Hogan in front of the world at WrestleMania, changed hands in a quiet Canadian arena with the cameras rolling only for a videotape. That is how much the company had changed in a single year. The spectacle had shrunk, but the substance, the actual quality of the wrestling, had never been higher. Bret Hart's championship win is now recognized as the true beginning of what would be called the new generation. The idea that a wrestler could reach the very top, not because he was the biggest man in the room, but because he was the best. It opened a door that had been locked for a decade. In the years that followed, smaller, more athletic, more technically gifted performers would walk through that door, men who never would have been given a chance in the Hulkamania days. Bret Hart, in that quiet Saskatoon building, was the first. There is something almost poetic about how it happened. The company did not choose Bret Hart because it suddenly had a grand vision of a new kind of hero. It chose him because it had run out of other options. The Giants had left. The muscle-bound formula was under legal siege, and when the company looked around the locker room, the man standing there with the most talent, the most reliability, the most quiet professionalism was the technician they had once dismissed as too small to matter. Necessity, more than inspiration, put that belt around his waist, but the result was the same. A door that had been shut to an entire type of performer swung open, and it never fully closed again. Every technically brilliant, undersized wrestler who reached the top in the decades that followed owed a small debt to what happened in Saskatoon that night. Bret made himself impossible to ignore, and in a year when the company had nowhere else to turn, that was enough. He also made a promise right there after the win that would come to define his character. He declared that he would be a fighting champion, a man who would defend his title anywhere, against anyone, on any night. Not the kind of champion who hid behind the belt and picked easy opponents, and he lived up to it. In the weeks that followed, Bret defended the championship against a long list of challengers on house shows across the country, wrestling far more often than a Hogan-era champion ever would have. It was a different philosophy of what a champion should be. Less a distant, godlike figure to be protected, and more a working man who earned his place every single night. That too was part of the changing of the guard. To close out the year, the company held Survivor Series in late November, and this show, more than any other, revealed the shape of the future. The old guard was almost entirely gone. Hogan absent, Warrior gone, Piper largely stepping back, Jake Roberts, who had turned villain and feuded with The Undertaker earlier in the year, had left after WrestleMania. Sid was gone too, having departed the company after failing a drug test in the spring, a small but telling sign of the new scrutiny everyone was under. In their place, a wave of new faces was arriving. Survivor Series 1992 featured the pay-per-view debut of Razor Ramon, a slick, arrogant, toothpick-flicking tough guy modeled on a certain kind of movie gangster played by a performer named Scott Hall, who would go on to change the entire industry. It featured the debut of Yokozuna, a massive former sumo character billed at over 500 pounds who destroyed his opponent in a matter of minutes and immediately looked like an unstoppable monster. He would win the world title within 5 months. It even featured the first pay-per-view appearance of Doink the Clown, an evil circus clown who somehow became one of the most memorable characters of the era. Think about what that debut lineup represents. Razor Ramon, Yokozuna, Doink, all appearing on the same show for the first time on the big stage at the exact moment the old guard was vanishing. This was the company visibly refilling its shelves in real time. The men who had defined the previous era were walking out one door while an entirely new cast walked in another. And crucially, these new characters did not depend on the enormous chemically enhanced bodies of the past. Razor Ramon's appeal was attitude and cool. Yokozuna's was size, yes, but the size of a sumo, not a bodybuilder. Doink's was pure creepy theater. The company was learning, out of necessity, that there was more than one way to build a star. And in the main event, the two men who represented the company's real future faced each other for the first time on a major stage. World Wrestling Federation champion Bret Hart defended his title against the Intercontinental champion Shawn Michaels. Michaels was another perfect symbol of the changing times. Earlier that January, in a talk show segment called The Barbershop, he had turned on his longtime tag team partner Marty Jannetty, super kicking him and famously throwing him through a plate glass window. It was the moment the Heartbreak Kid was born as a singles star. Cocky, gorgeous, cowardly, and brilliantly talented, Michaels was everything the new World Wrestling Federation wanted in a villain. And in the Survivor Series main event, he and Bret Hart wrestled a near 30-minute classic that pointed directly at the future. These two men, both smaller, both extraordinary in the ring, would go on to define the entire decade to come, their rivalry becoming one of the most storied in the history of the business. Bret retained his title that night, and as 1992 came to a close, the picture was clear. The company that had begun the year, desperately searching for a new leader, had, through trial and error, through the loss of its giants and the elevation of its craftsmen, found its answer. It had found Bret Hart. It had found Shawn Michaels. It had begun to build a new roster of characters who would carry it through the lean years ahead. But we cannot end this story on a purely triumphant note, because that is not the honest truth of 1992. The honest truth is that all of this creative reinvention was happening under the darkest cloud imaginable. Throughout the year, the scandals only deepened. Beyond the substances grand jury that was building its case against Vince McMahon, a second and far uglier controversy erupted in the spring. Allegations of sexual misconduct within the company involving ring boys, the young men who helped set up the ring before shows, and involving executives close to McMahon. Names were named, lawsuits were filed. The story spilled out of the wrestling world and into mainstream news programs. Vince McMahon found himself appearing on national talk shows, on programs hosted by Larry King and Phil Donahue, forced to defend not choreographed matches, but his company's basic decency. On one of those broadcasts, the host pointed out that the World Wrestling Federation had generated enormous revenue, more in a year than the National Football League, and that some of the misconduct allegations involved juveniles. The studio audience gasped, and beyond even that, a former referee came forward that year with a horrifying personal allegation against McMahon himself, describing it in detail on television. McMahon denied it completely, but the sheer accumulation of it, the substances, the misconduct scandal, the personal allegations, the federal investigation, all landing in the same 12-month span, meant that by any reasonable expectation, 1992 should have been the year the whole empire collapsed. It didn't. McMahon would eventually stand trial and be acquitted of the substances charges. The company would survive, battered and bruised and much smaller than before, into a leaner and stranger era. Attendance in America had cratered. The stars of the golden age had scattered. The muscle-bound aesthetic was quietly being dialed back as substances testing came in, and the bodies in the ring grew visibly smaller. The company that emerged from 1992 was a fundamentally different animal than the one that had entered it, and that, in the end, is why this year matters so much. 1992 is the hinge on which the entire history of the company turns. On one side of it sits the roaring, cartoonish, chemically enhanced spectacle of the 1980s, the world of Hulk Hogan and saying your prayers and taking your vitamins. On the other side sits everything that came after, the technical new generation of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, the eventual arrival of a foul-mouthed rebel named Steve Austin, and the Attitude Era that would save the company entirely. The Monday Night Wars, the modern, publicly traded global entertainment machine. None of that happens without the painful, awkward, scandal-ridden transition of 1992. This was the year the company was forced, by circumstance and crisis, to change what a wrestling star could be. The giants left, so it turned to the artists. The old formula died, so it was forced to invent a new one. The empire shook to its foundations, and in the shaking, it accidentally discovered its own future. So when people look back at 1992 and remember only the botched Hogan and Sid main event, or the silly Papa Shango voodoo curse, or the endless embarrassing headlines, they are missing the deeper truth. This was one of the most important years the industry ever produced. It gave us the greatest Royal Rumble ever assembled. It gave us a magical night at Wembley in front of 80,000 souls. It gave us Bret Hart's quiet coronation in a Canadian arena, a moment that redefined who was allowed to be champion. And it gave us the first glimpse of the men and the ideas that would carry professional wrestling into its most successful era of all. The empire cracked in 1992, but out of those cracks, something new began to grow, and whether they knew it or not, everyone who watched that year was watching one world end and another one being born. That's the story of the World Wrestling Federation in 1992, a year of scandal and survival, a year of endings and beginnings, a year when the biggest company in the business lost its brightest stars, faced its darkest moment, and somehow, against all odds, found the path to its future. If you enjoyed this deep dive, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more long-form wrestling history breakdowns, just like this one. Let us know down in the comments which year you'd like us to to cover next, and which moment from 1992 stands out the most to you. Until next time, thanks for watching.